The Roman Republic and the Roman Empire were both extremely careful to never bestow the title of king or rex onto anyone. In fact, even Caesar, arguably the most beloved and important Roman of all time, nearly faced ruin after being hailed as a king. The title represented something sinister to the Romans throughout nearly their whole history following the overthrow of the last king of Rome. That begs the question, why? Why was calling someone a king so taboo in Rome? Before we get any further into today's episode, I just want to quickly ask that you subscribe and like if you enjoy my content. It really helps the channel out and it motivates me to make more content. Also, follow me on Twitter to get updates about any videos in progress. Now back to your regularly scheduled programming. Before we can look at how the title of king gained its reputation in later iterations of the Roman state, we first need to look at what being a king meant in the days of the Roman kingdom. The kings ruled Rome from its legendary founding by Romulus in 753 BCE to the overthrow of the last king, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, more commonly called Tarquin the Proud, in 509 BCE. In this time, 7 kings are recorded. These 7 kings are mostly accepted as being actual rulers. However, historians disagree on if there were more kings, or if the kingship had actually been around for much longer. Historians also generally struggle with the feats given to all these rulers, but more on that in a moment. Prior to the 5th king, Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, or Tarquin the Elder, the kingship of Rome was not hereditary. Instead, the king was chosen by popular vote by the citizens of Rome. To conduct this vote, the Roman people would gather in what was known as the Curate Assembly, where only male citizens were allowed to vote. After the death of the previous king, the Senate would appoint one of its own to serve as an interrex, meaning literally in between king. The interrex had a term of 5 days. If those 5 days passed before a king was elected, then the interrex, with the approval of the Senate, was required to appoint yet another interrex. The interrex would search for a suitable candidate. This candidate could hypothetically be from any Roman class, but were mostly Roman or even foreign aristocrats. The candidate would then be brought before the Senate to receive their approval before going before the Curate Assembly. If the candidate was rejected, the process would start all over again. If the candidate was accepted, the newly elected king was required to perform 2 ceremonial acts to receive his imperium. Firstly, the king needed to receive the favor of the gods. To do this, an elaborate ceremony was performed by a series of augurs. The augurs instructed the king-elect to sit on a stone seat within the main citadel of Rome. The augurs would then interpret the will in favor of the gods through actions of certain birds. We have no record of it, but technically, if the augurs determined the king-elect received unfavorable omens from the gods, they would not be allowed to take up the true kingship. After receiving approval from the gods, the king-elect needed to receive final approval from the people. The first vote only determined who held the title of king, not who held the imperium. To receive the imperium of the king-elect would submit a law to the Curate Assembly which bestowed imperium upon him. Only after those 2 steps could the king-elect actually rule. Before we go any further, I should make a quick note to say that much of what we will be talking about in this series is shrouded in myth and legend. If there was one thing the Romans were good at, it was embellishing their own history. So we should take some of these stories and some of this information with a bit of skepticism. Some events are of course just myths, such as Romulus ascending to Mount Olympus to become a god after his reign. However, some of these stories and attributions are likely embellishments, or just explanations for the establishment of important political entities and traditions. The Romans loved to establish authenticity through referring back to older history. Because of this, we have stories of Romulus creating the Senate and the patricians, and being the first person to have lictors follow him around, and, well, you get the point. The Romans liked to link important traditions with important people, and thus, many of these kings likely received credit for things that they either had no or little role in. I think this is just something important to keep in mind when we talk about the individual kings. After receiving their imperium, the kings were entitled to hold several symbols of authority, many of which would eventually be transferred to both the consuls of the Republic and the emperors of the empire. Firstly, the king was entitled to 12 lictors. Lictors were civil servants who acted as both advisors and bodyguards to anyone who held imperium within the different iterations of the Roman state. The more lictors a position held, the more power and imperium afforded to them. The king, consuls, and emperors all traditionally held 12 lictors. The only position that would have more would be the dictator of the Republican era, who would be entitled to 24 lictors. Another symbol of power was that of the curule seat. This seat was a foldable and easily transportable seat that would follow the king around wherever he went. This seat was sort of similar to the more modern idea of a throne. It represented the imperium held by the king, and provided a sort of status symbol, as the king would likely have been the only person seated during state business. Roman kings also seem to have been the originator for the heads of state, king, consul, or emperor wearing a purple toga. The kings of Rome were absolute rulers. They were the personification of the state, and even the Senate served at the pleasure of and for the king. The supreme power afforded to the king can really be broken up into three main categories: judicial power, legislative power, and executive power. I'm sure that sounds very familiar for all my American friends. On the judicial side, the king was the supreme judge of the state. The king had power over both civil and criminal trials, and had supreme power in times of peace and war. They were able to appoint lesser judges to deal with the day-to-day trials and lesser crimes that the king felt no need to intervene in. A council did advise the king during trials brought before him. However, this council could be easily overruled or easily ignored. On the executive side, the king was the only holder of executive imperium in the Roman kingdom. The king could not be charged with any crime nor persecuted for any abuse of power, as in the end, all the powers and laws came from the king himself. The king possessed unchecked military authority. He could direct the standing Roman army to do anything he wished, save for declare war. The king had the power to appoint all other office holders, and each office holder served at the will of the king, including that of senator. The most important appointee was that of tribunus salarium, or the tribune of the Salaries. The Salaries was the elite cavalry unit of the Roman army who served as the bodyguards of the Roman king. Unlike other units of the Roman army of the time, the Salaries served permanently. The Salaries were made of the most well-trained, disciplined, and all-around badass troops of the Roman nobility. The tribune of the Salaries was essentially the Roman king's second-in-command. He was appointed to the office upon the accession of the king. The tribune held the power to pass laws and preside over the curate assembly. Hypothetically, the tribune also served as the only real check on the king's power. They technically had the ability to summon the curate assembly, and with their agreement remove the king's imperium. In practice, however, this was essentially impossible, as the king would almost always appoint his most trusted advisor, usually a member of his family, to the office. In fact, the only time this ever happened was in the overthrow of the last Roman king. More on that in a few episodes. The tribune of the Salaries would actually be the position that would be the blueprint for that of dictator and master of the horse in the Republican period. Another important office appointed by the king was that of praefectus urbi, literally prefect of the city. This person was entrusted with the king's power within the city of Rome if the king had to leave the city for whatever reason. These men quite literally only held their imperium within the walls of Rome itself. This office wasn't always filled, and a person was typically only appointed when the king knew he would not be returning to Rome for quite some time. Lastly, on the legislative side, the king was the ultimate source of legislative power within the kingdom. Officially, the Senate and the curate assembly served as the legislative branch of the Roman kingdom. In practice, however, the two could only meet, vote, or even discuss issues at the request of the king. The king mostly ruled by personal decree, which, remember, was limited by no other office, and he would really only call meetings of either the Senate or the curate assembly to either declare war or for the passage or observation of ceremonial laws or festivities. The Roman king would eventually be overthrown in 509 BCE. The powers of the office would mostly transfer to that of consul. However, the key difference in the structure of the Roman government would be the checks put in place to restrict the power of individuals. Save for the case of dictator, every position in the Roman Republic had someone or some political body that could act as a check on the individual's power. That was the key lesson that Rome had learned from its kings. And it was the idea of unchecked personal power that would frighten so many generations of Romans afterwards. This was just part 1 in our series discussing the 7 Roman kings. Join me next time as we discuss one of the most important figures in Roman history, and Rome's first king, Romulus. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it and I hope you learned something. If you have any comments on the video or believe I've made a mistake, please comment down below. And please like and subscribe if you enjoyed it. It really helps the channel out. I want to particularly thank Eric R., I hope I pronounced that right. And Logan Davies for commenting and subscribing. Greek content will be coming soon. Peace.